Hi, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Wherever you are joining us from, this is Abhijit Bhaduri. I work as a leadership and executive coach, and I also help organizations and individuals work on their social media strategy. Well, today I've got a person who, let me just start by saying a couple of different things. Now, you pick the one that impresses you the most. One, this person has got 4 patents. Okay, not impressed? Okay, let me give you another one. He worked with Andy Grove, for his book Only the Paranoid Survive. He was the lead researcher in that. I say, oh, I'm not impressed. Third, he's been a VC. Okay, you're not impressed. Fine. He is part of, Stanford's faculty. Still not impressed? Then let me just say that he's written a fabulous book, which I think you should completely read. And that book is called The Brains and Brawn Company. But you know what? You got to wait for a second because all good things take time. And that's what Rob, you've got so many things that I sort of dropped off to all the listeners, and none of them were impressed. So you got to tell me which one are you most proud of?
Being a father and a husband, all those other things, not so much. It's just kind of the thing as we've talked about earlier. I'm not that important, but I know a lot of interesting people. And so the stuff that I've done, I'm just an average person trying to get through life one day at a time. And now most spending my time as a teacher.
All right. I must do you have the book handy, The Brains and Brawn Company?
The Brains and
Ah,
Brawn Company. Here you go. How
there you go.
leading
I mean,
organizations blend the best of digital and physical.
yeah, and so this is funny because I read the digital version of it, and I can't sort of hold my phone up like that and say, this is what it is. But you
The
know what? You've
physical
got the
world's not
physical.
going away.
Yeah, and if I were to sort of really say that uh, the book that you've written, The Brains and Brawn Company, and we'll come to that in a little bit because I just think that it is so relevant. I absolutely recommend to all my listeners and readers that you should read that book. The reason is, when you look at anything, I mean, you order something on Amazon or you order food on Swiggy, Zomato, whatever you are doing, we almost expect it to magically appear on our doorstep, and we are sort of saying, "Oh my God, it's taking 4 minutes. How bad is that?" And this we forget how much of the physical world is really involved when it comes to creating a delightful customer experience. And that's what struck me because you talk about 10 competencies, but I'm going to hold off a little bit more on that. But I want to first talk to you about you've talked about the dilemma. Tell me more about whose dilemma are you talking about now?
So the idea behind the book comes out of two of my courses, The Industrialist Dilemma and Systems Leadership at Stanford. And when we started the course, The Industrialist Dilemma, 7 years ago, our thesis was that all of these disruptive companies coming out of Silicon Valley largely were completely reshaping now new industries, whether it was healthcare or banking, fintech, mobility, et cetera, with a whole new way of doing things. The way you used to develop products in the past was changing from the old world to new ways of moving towards Agile and Scrum. And how you had to organize your company became different. And so as products and services became increasingly digital connected, everything about how you ran a business was going to be different. And so the idea was we thought we'd study some incumbents, and some of the incumbents we'd see a few that were doing okay, but most of them would be struggling. And we'd see these disruptors coming in who were completely changing the world. And I got to tell you, boy, were we wrong. What we really learned as we started studying about the 60 plus companies that have come to the course over the last 7 years was that a lot of the incumbents really understood a lot of the changes of digitization and how to apply it to their core competencies. And several of the disruptors really had a lot to learn about ways to work with government, ways to develop deeper relationships with customers, the need for customization. You couldn't just have everybody on the same platform. And so we really kind of saw this new world that blends digital and physical. And that's what led to the thesis behind the book.
When you look at some of the things that you've talked about in the past, I mean, I had this whole thought that how do you manage this whole business of change, because organizations are essentially very different today, especially if you look at it in the last 10 years or so. Organizations are very different. They may look the same, but the core of it inside has changed a lot. What do you see as the most defining factor which creates the dilemmas that people struggle with, the leaders struggle with, and which is really the thesis of your book, The Industrialist Dilemma?
Well, if you look at what allowed people to rise up in organizations, they got rewarded for doing things the old way. They got promoted, they got pay raises. You put structures and systems in place in worlds that were either digital or physical, and they were oftentimes never connected. And what's changed now is that when a leader has to understand digital and physical, this is where we get to this notion of systems leadership. Leaders today really need to understand what happens when functions inside of an organization interact with each other. What's the action and reaction? So when sales, sell something new to a customer base, what does that do to the manufacturing line? And the people on the manufacturing floor really need to understand both the customer and the sales leader to understand what needs to be built. Similarly, if you're in finance, you've got to understand how your organization is interacting with other players in its ecosystem. And you really need to understand what's happening outside the building that will drive and shape the behaviors that underlie the meaning of the numbers and the financials that you could be putting out. And so I think what's different is you need this duality of a systems leader of understanding hardware and software, understanding IQ and EQ, understanding what happens when systems interact with each other. You can't just stay in your silo anymore, that whether you are a mid-level manager or a director or a C-level executive, you really have to understand all of these things, and understanding things like how do you make sure you hit your numbers on a weekly or monthly basis? And at the same token, how do you design an organization that can be systematically investing in innovation and disruption themselves?
So when you looked at this whole notion of the change that has come in, you talk about 10 competencies, and what is you worked in many of these corporations. You worked in GE. You've got some great experience in investing in different kinds of companies. You work with. Tell me a little about your work experience and background, so we know that where you get all those ideas from.
So I've been very lucky and very fortunate. I've worked for very large and very small companies. So I ran a division of GE. I worked at Intel. You mentioned my work with Andy Grove. I worked in the predecessor of Intel Capital, and I was a product manager there. I worked at Sun Microsystems. I was also a multi-time entrepreneur. I started a company that made the world's first digital picture frames, and that company was acquired by Kodak. Worked for a company that was spun out of the engineering school at the university here at Stanford, made image sensors and image processors, and got bought by Sony. I was a middle-level executive in a company we took public in the mid-90s, a software company. So I've seen very large and very small. And so I've dealt with a lot of the issues that we deal with in the companies that come now to Stanford. If you're a disruptor, how do you try to drive change in a market? If you're an incumbent, how do you simultaneously hold on to that which has made you great, but make sure you don't become obsolete? And so my background as an operator and then as an investor for the last 15 years, combined with my work in academia, has really, I think, given me a unique perspective from these three different angles to kind of look at the companies and hopefully take some best learnings and best practices and then share them with our students, share them through the book, or share them with companies that I consult for.
Super. So, what I want to do for the listeners today is to actually talk about very briefly the 10 competencies. And I like the way that you structured it. I created a little visual and I shared that with, the people on Twitter. It's just, 10 competencies that are there. Some which you define as, the brain competencies, and some which are the brawn competencies. Yeah. So when you say brain competencies, what are you sort of really looking at? So I sort of made a couple of notes which, so for example, your brain competencies, you talk about analytics, creativity, empathy, managing risk, and also about, the ownership and partnerships. So let's start looking at analytics. What do you sort of mean by what is the possibility that analytics can do, which people aren't already doing now? What do you see are some of the possibilities? And you talked about Charles Schwab as a company. So, so we have some of our listeners who are sort of chiming in, and Anish says everything is going digital. So, What's your point of view on the physical part of it? Let's begin with that. And maybe, Anish, we'll come back when we talk about the bronze part of it. That's where we'll talk about all the physical competencies. And so we'll talk about, address all your questions. So thanks for that question, guys. If anybody else has a question, please feel free to ask. But yeah, Rob, let's get started. So let's do with analytics.
So it's interesting. It's not everything's going digital. Everything's going digital and physical. We are still a physical species, and even the pandemic has proven that. And so I think the thing I want people to take away is that the best companies are combining both digital and physical. You might call it mind and body. You might call it old world and new world. But the idea behind Brains and Brawn, if we think about how our brain works, the brain does actually many different things for us. So analytics, the left hemisphere of the brain, this is the part where it's table stakes to have data engineers and data scientists. And every company on the planet needs that, whether you're Google or whether you're Charles Schwab, which is a fairly well-established financial services company. But the thing about analytics, it's not just the ability to crunch the data. It's what do you do with the data once you have it? What is your North Star? And Walt Bettinger and the team at Schwab really impressed me with their thinking about it. Every question they ask themselves always is they have this data and this information, and they say, what would our customers want us to do with it? Let's look through clients' eyes to think about what we should be doing with this information. There are over $7 trillion in assets that have been deposited at Charles Schwab. Huge organization, lots of responsibilities. And if one of their customers goes onto their website and goes to the pull down menu that says life events and then clicks on divorce, at that moment in time, Charles Schwab might know something that's happening in one of their clients' personal lives even before their spouse does. And the question that Walt and the team asks themselves is, well, what should we do with this information? What would our customer want us to do with this information? And by the way, maybe the right answer is to do nothing. Now, let me juxtapose that with Facebook. We were talking before the show about how Facebook, the Wall Street Journal has written a lot of stories in the last few days about, their X check and all these other things that Facebook is doing. And there's a conventional wisdom that we all believe, even if we use their products, that Facebook will use our data to whatever Facebook thinks is in Facebook's interest, right? Not what we might want them to do, but they'll do whatever they're going back to Cambridge Analytica. They'll do whatever they think. If they think they can sell our data to make another buck, even if we wouldn't want it, they'll sell our data to make another buck. So even with analytics, it's not just that you've got to be good at crunching the numbers. It's not just good that you have to understand the flow of communication that you have with your customers, but you have to ask yourself the human question, what can you do with it and what should you do with it? Just because you can do something doesn't mean that as a company you should do something.
That's I think it's one of the ways that I sort of look at it in my book, Dreamers and Unicorns. I talk about polarities, so that you have to manage the polarity of when you are looking at analytics. You probably also have to look at the polarity, which is ethics. You have to look at the polarity of understanding storytelling. You have to understand people's apprehensions about data. And again, I like that phrase that just because you can, you shouldn't do it. So I think that's one of the pieces where we need to, and why, we should, when we look at systems leadership, maybe one of the questions we'll sort of explore a little bit is what comes in the way of leaders actually making those ethical calls. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But I want to sort of move to the other piece, which is, to me, a little bit related, which is empathy. That, maybe to have that sense of empathy with the listeners, which is what you define as, the ability to connect with the customers and with warmth and generosity. That's the phrase you've used. Tell me more about that. How does that play out as a competency?
Well, it's a great. That's actually where I was going to head next. The amygdala is another part of our brain, which kind of regulates our ability to connect with others. And so the leader that we studied deeply in that book was a gentleman named Bernard Tyson, who ran Kaiser Permanente for many years. Kaiser Permanente is one of the largest vertically integrated healthcare companies here. It's about $80 billion US per year. And Bernard would talk about having empathy for every part of the people that he interacted with. He talked about the importance of understanding his doctors and his nurses and the challenges that they were having. He used to spend one day a month just watching his doctors and nurses work. He would get out of the conference room, he would clear his schedule of meetings, and he would just watch how they worked. He would talk about obviously empathy for his members. I remember one time he came to class and he had just come from a meeting with family relatives of some of his former members who had actually died. And he was like listening to the family members, and he was kept asking himself, did we do enough? Did we do what we should have done in all aspects of managing a customer's dying years? Did we do a good enough job? He was always very touched by that. He even talked about empathy for the government, if you can believe that. And Bernard had very defined political views. Like, he had a view of the world. But when he was talking to people in Washington, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, what always went through his head was, no matter what this person is saying, this representative or this senator is representing my members, the men and women who I'm responsible for caring for. So I've got to listen closely, because whatever they're saying, even if I don't necessarily think I agree with it, they're saying what they think because they think it's in the best interest of their constituents. And so it really allowed him to have a healthy relationship with government, regardless of what his political views were. And I think this notion of empathy, which is oftentimes, I think, overused in the vernacular of business, it actually becomes really important just to try to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to try to figure out how to deliver great products and services that will meet the needs of other people, and how you can use your fellow travelers in an ecosystem to maybe get to the best outcomes for what you want.
We have Ria, who joins us from Pune. So says, what is that country that in your view, what India lacks behind, and being, let's say, some of the more digitalized countries, or being more profitable, or what makes the companies more profitable? What is your take on that? That's a question.
So I think with profitability, if you look at the United States and China, where most of the big tech companies have been clustered so far, a lot of it has had to do around infrastructure, a large domestic markets where a lot of people can take advantage of it. And in the case of China, a rising GDP, and in the case of the US, an already large GDP. And so I think India's GDP is going to continue to rise. Right? You see this great nation, which is has actually spawned an incredible number of amazing tech companies so far. You have a highly educated population. So I think, India, I'm actually very, very positive and upbeat over the next couple of decades as to what's going to happen there. China, I think, had, a more, what I'll call a controlled, path towards its economic rise in the last 2.5 decades. They systematically borrowed technology from the West, incorporated it in, and they basically borrowed it. That was basically the ticket they did to give access to the Chinese market, and they were able to do that because it was a very, very strong, sense of government control. In India, you go 100 kilometers, and you're going to be basically in a whole new cultural phenomenon of new languages, new food, and so India is a much more diverse country than China is, and so I think India will eventually continue to grow and evolve, and the people will continue to have a rising standard of living. Just might take a little bit longer, but India is well on its path to, I think, becoming a global technology power, and profits will follow from that.
Yeah, so I would just supplement your response by saying that, I think we've got a couple of, what are called the JAM technologies, the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and, the Mudra technologies, where you've got all the building blocks. And I think a lot of the startups that are coming up now are building on those. And because you have the biometrics in place, you have the payment systems in place, you've got the data supply in place. You've got cheap, digital. It's the lowest cost of data in the world. So I think that you've got a lot of things which are going. And I also feel that there is going to be a lot more innovation coming out of India, which is going to be there. And I also think that the next billion, you are seeing a different class of entrepreneurs coming up in India, which has grown up in the tier 3, tier 4 cities, which is where the market is. But they've also gone to, the B schools such as yours, or, some of the other B schools around the world. So they understand how to present the idea to the VCs. they know what it takes to make it profitable, and they are also able to build it. So I think I would sort of look at that as a very important element of the way we think it's going to shape up. I want to sort of really talk to you about harnessing creativity, which is what you mentioned in your book, which is the third competency that you talked about, which is interestingly very unlikely example of the Align Tech, which are people who make these braces, which are invisible braces. I thought that was such a great example. I've never thought of that as a great example, but yeah, it really set me thinking about it. So tell me more.
So, creativity, the right hemisphere of our brain, which is, how do we come up with sometimes what we think of as disruptive? And what Align Technology did, that I think is really interesting, is they blended a technological breakthrough with a business model breakthrough. Now, on the technological breakthrough, if, you or your children ever had braces, the brackets and wires that are on our teeth and they hurt and they're no fun and they think they make us look ugly. What actually a couple of graduates from the Graduate School of Business at Stanford figured out is that with plastic molds, you can actually move teeth and do so in a way that is actually more specific and easier to do for the consumer. It looks better, and you can give a highly customized solution to everybody that's not kind of this what I'll call monolithic solution through brackets and wires. And what's really interesting about it is what Align has done is they take a digital picture of your mouth and they come up with a plan for moving the teeth. They work with generally orthodontists, but sometimes dentists. We'll get to that in a moment. And then they actually ship off and make these 500,000 units per day of these clear plastic aligners that we put on our teeth. In fact, I'm using them right now, and you can take them out when you eat. And then you put them back in when you're done eating, and you wear them about 20 hours a day, and you can get a highly customized smile, and they can move individual teeth. And the company is the world's largest user of 3D printers. I mean, think about that. They use the digitization to take pictures of our mouth. They then very, very detailed make these clear plastic aligners. They're making $500,000 per day, and they can give you a customized smile, because what's considered an attractive smile in Southeast Asia is different than South America, is different than Europe, is different than North America. And so they can give customized smiles for each individual. What they also did, which was really interesting, is in the old days you had orthodontists over here who straightened our teeth, and you had dentists over here who cleaned our teeth. This solution is so simple, they were able to expand the market by allowing dentists to sell these clear plastic aligners. So they, with their creativity, really blended a business model innovation with a technological innovation, and the company's now worth 60 billion US dollars. I mean, there are a lot of people who are trying to do these clear plastic aligners. No one on the planet has done it as well as Align Technology.
That's such a brilliant example, and I think that it's one of the hypotheses I talk about in my book is that when you look at the greatest business models going forward are going to be based on emotions. I mean, this is one that it makes me feel more attractive.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just such a brilliant example of how aligned technology is sort of working. And then you talk about managing risk, and which is another one that is risk taking something that organizations need to sort of have fluctuate over and above. What are some of the signals that you think they should be looking at when it comes to managing risks? What is that?
The prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that manages risk, often talked about fight or flight. And so the company we studied here was the world's largest alcoholic beverage company and beer company, AB InBev. And this is an organization that grew globally, started really kind of in Brazil, and made acquisitions in Europe and North America. And their method for growth was buy companies at scale and then operational excellence. And in about 2015, Carlos Brito, who was the CEO, got kind of in trouble with his board, because his board said, you're not being innovative enough. You're not taking enough risk. And by the way, there's no one else left to buy on the planet. So how are we going to grow? Because we've already bought everybody. And so he then took one of his rising leaders, a guy by the name of Pedro Earp, and said, Pedro, I want you to become our chief disruptive growth officer. And Earp looked at him and said, Brito, what is that? And Brito looked back at him and said, you go figure it out. And so Pedro's trying to decide, should he take this job or not? And so he comes back 3 days later, and he comes up with this idea of what became what's now called ZX, which is the innovation organization inside of AB InBev. Now, what's really interesting is before he accepted the job, Earp looked at Brito and said, Brito, if I'm successful, I'm going to have a very small impact on the business, relatively speaking. We're tens of billions of dollars a year, and even in 4 or 5 years, I'm going to have a very small impact. How do I know if I'm being successful? Is this really a job that I should take? Earp was running a country at that point in time. He had thousands of people reporting to him, managed a multi-$100 million year budget, and now he was going to be kind of this little person on the side. And Brito looked at him and said, Pedro, you will be successful when after 5+ years, your job is no longer necessary, because what you will have done is infected our entire organization on how to think differently, on how to operate differently, and how to run towards the disruption, right? As consumers' tastes are changing, and so we have to know where our consumers are and our customers are. We have to operate differently. Your job is to infect the organization so that your job is no longer needed. Now, if you think about that, Brito just told Earp his job is successful when he no longer has a job. All right. Now, how many of you go to work every day and say, good, if I no longer have a job, that's what winning looks like? And so what happened is Earp had to take the risk inside internally himself. Taking risk meant I'm going to put my career at risk, and I'm going to trust that the organization will take care of me. And so this notion today of taking risks and running towards the disruption, it's not just something the company has to do. It's individuals need to do it. You need to realize that it's a personal thing that we need to do if we're going to drive an organization to change. Now, in this particular case, Earp did such a good job. He got promoted to not only being the chief disruptive growth officer, but he became the chief marketing officer as well, because he knew and believed that Brito, as the CEO, would take care of him. And that's exactly what happened.
Oh my God! What a perfect segue into the question that Vishal has asked. He just asked this question that all companies and businesses are doing digital marketing. So, is there any marketing we can do for businesses, and specifically in the context of an ed tech firm, what can be something which is unique, that an ed tech firm would do, and this is something that, is there one thing that comes to your mind?
It's interesting. Here I am. I've got a face for podcasts, and I've become a television star in the last 18 months because of the pandemic. I'm in my home office right now. I've got the picture of the Stanford Oval behind me. My office used to have pictures of my grandparents and my wife and my children up, and my parents, and now it's decorated in Stanford gear. And so I think what is happening in ed tech is, I think that education is never going to be the same because of the pandemic. And so if you look at our ability to kind of use very, very low cost, simple technology, gives us ways to reach customers, and it can be very interactive. In the case with students, we can design interactive and educational systems and programs to be able to work with the students. By the way, that's from students from 5 to 18, and then even at higher education. So especially as connectivity becomes increasingly available to a wider audience, I am hugely optimistic in our ability to be able to touch and educate people all over the world. And so not only can you in your ed tech company, educate people in your surrounding area, but you should also be thinking of what can you be doing outside of India. Not just in your large domestic market, but in other parts of the world. I teach people in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Sao Paulo, Stuttgart, and here I am talking to a group of people largely on the other side of the world in the evening in India, while the sun's just coming up here in California. I am a big believer that education is never going to be the same. And so the trick's going to be not just marketing, how do we reach them? And social media channels are a way to do that. But I think also the ability to deliver a rich experience in ways that we couldn't do before. Shaheen Mistry, who is the woman who founded Teach for India, is one of the most inspiring leaders I've ever met. I love how when I was visiting her in India last time I was there, and she was talking about how what she wanted Teach for India to be was, empowering her people to go into whatever village that they were working with and kind of make it what worked there in that village, not to have kind of a monolithic overriding architecture of how you had to educate, the children. And so I kind of like that notion of hopefully the digitization allows us to deliver customized solutions. We'll talk about this in the context of systems leadership. You need a platform, the internet, which allows us to operate globally, but then can you customize the education for specific regions or specific areas? So I'm hugely optimistic on the future of education, and I think that the bold will be the people who will be able to drive how we educate people on a go-forward basis.
And I also think that, one of the things that I see happening in the world of education is that you will see the rise of, people who are exceptionally good. I mean, the superstar educators will actually go global. I mean, they'll become global brands. So you will
Mhm.
see a professor of whatever, economics or some such thing, will become a global brand in as much, revered and thought about in Kenya as in India, as in US, as in China. You sort of see that. I mean, because of the power of the internet to make everything boundaryless. So yes, I certainly think that that's one of the pieces. But I want to switch back to the last of the brain competency, which is ownership and partnership, which I thought was one of the most powerful ones, which is how does a company decide what do you own and what do you outsource? How do you sort of take that decision? What was your big insight on that?
Oh, well, I think there are a few things that we have to filter this, especially in a world that's changing so rapidly. No company can do it on its own. Now, the counter to that is somebody will say, Rob, look at Apple, look at Tesla. They do everything. And I'm like, okay, if you're Steve Jobs or Tim Cook or Elon Musk, you can do everything on your own. If you're the other 7.5 billion people on the planet, you better learn how to partner. And so, what you would think really want to focus in on, what are the core things that you want to own internally that really is going to determine your ability to deliver a great experience to the customer. In the book, I study Instacart. Instacart has this four-sided market, which involves the shoppers, it involves the grocery stores. And by the way, Instacart delivers groceries to here and people in North America. So you've got the shoppers who get the grocery stores themselves, the customers who do the shopping on our phones and on our computers, and then the consumer packaged good companies, the people who sell us the goods that we use. And so you have one of these situations where Instacart had to figure out, where do we want to own things? And they believed the digital platform, that was their kind of core competency that they were good at. But they had to figure out they couldn't deliver a great solution if they didn't have everybody else lined up as part of the solution, and that they weren't allowing those other people to be able to get what they needed out of participating in the solution. So you start with, what does the customer want, which we wanted to get our groceries delivered at home. You figure out, what are you going to own that you're good at? And then how do you have to fill in those holes with other people and other competencies in other companies? Instacart did a great job at this. And I think they did what I really liked about it is they were very nuanced in trying to understand what the customers needed. And, they started as a very, very small company, and now they've become quite important and quite large. They're able to actually drive some of the interactions between the other players in their ecosystem. But they knew they couldn't do it all by themselves, but they didn't try. The last example I'll give on this is Target. Target, the large American retailer, in 2011, they knew that e-commerce was going to be a big part of their business. So they made a conscious decision. IBM was running the Target website, for e-commerce. Target brought it in-house. They said, this is too important to us. We cannot trust somebody outside. We've got to know how to do this. Even if we haven't started as a digital e-commerce company, we know that digital e-commerce is part of the future. We have to make sure that we're good at this. And so I think knowing what you need to, like what your castle walls is something I talk about. What do you want inside your castle walls that you need to own? And, where are you going to let other people maybe control other parts of the land, but maybe hopefully you can do so in peace.
And from my understanding, you talked about the shoppers, the grocery stores, the customers, and the consumer goods companies. What's the difference between shoppers and customers?
So it's interesting. The customers are the people who end up paying, Instacart. The people who place the orders. The shoppers are the people who actually go to the stores, pick out the goods, and deliver it to the customers. And so, just kind of like the question for the shoppers is: are the shoppers going to be employees? Are they going to be gig employees? What's the relationship you want to have with those people? And that's very, very different from the men and women who are at home placing the orders to get the groceries delivered. And so, both are very, very important constituents. If you don't have both of those things, working properly, you don't have a business, right? If you don't have people buying the groceries, you don't have people delivering the groceries, there's no business for Instacart. So Instacart had to figure out, okay, how do we want to work with each of them? How do we make sure that each one of these groups can get what they need in shopping with us or working with us? And so trying to just really kind of put yourself in the mindset of those constituents is, I think, something that Apurva Mehta, now the chairman and the former CEO, did a really good job of.
And I sort of another way to look at it. So whoever asked this question, this whole thing that DoorDash used to, they sort of had to pivot from really being a company which was delivering food, because the margin on each of those food items was ridiculously small, because the average order size and the amount of money they made a $36 order was, closer to about 9 cents, and they had to move this up, so they started doing shopping, and they found that it was that they would ask the person to go and pick up your groceries on the way as they are delivering food. But that's a different conversation. So that's really the distinction I would sort of really talk about. Aditya Prasad Chakravarti says that it's a great talk, and he sort of gives a thumbs up. Aditya, wait, because we are barely halfway through. There's a lot more stuff which is there. You've just heard the brain part of it. Now we are going to come to the brawn part of it. So for those who joined us late, I'm talking to Robert Siegel, who's written this fabulous book. Robert, please do show that again. So those who didn't miss that. Because I only have the electronic version. So Brains and Brawn Company, absolutely must read. I recommend that you sort of do that. And I want to talk about the brawn side of it, which is the less glamorous side. Um, when you look at it, I mean, one of the economist podcasts that I heard this morning was talking about how the box has been such a game changer. The logistics companies,
Hmm.
because the fact that they could ship a whole lot of things in one box on top of a ship and moving it, on another system of the waterways altogether is a game changer. And what a long history and 200 years of refining, and then finally being where we are today. But you talked about logistics being a very important part of it. Talk to me a little more about that.
So logistics is this unsexy thing that's often in the back end, and it's dirty and it's hard and it's grungy and it's certainly not sexy. And very rarely do you see people who do logistics get written up in things like TechCrunch or in Fortune magazine, unless you're
Unless
Tim
you're
Cook.
Tim Cook.
Unless you're Tim Cook. If you're Tim Cook, it happens, but Tim doesn't count because Tim's Tim. But yeah, what's really happened now, and I think this is the key thing. Let's think of like Amazon, here in the United States. That for it to work, logistics has now become not just a back end thing, it's a front end thing. The connection between back end and front end is critical. Like if we shop, we want to know, does the company have the product in stock? And so we looked at 3 different companies on logistics. Like I refer to this as the spine on the physical side of the brawn. And so the spine is what makes everything work and operate. And so what's interesting is as we look at logistics, the 3 companies that I studied in detail were actually all retail companies. So the first is Best Buy. Best Buy is an electronics retailer here in the United States, which by all rights should have gone out of business. But Hubert Joly, the former CEO, and Corey Berry, the current CEO, what they figured out was as these electronic products have become increasingly connected, be it a camera, be it a phone, be it a television, the IT nature of these connected devices is very, very difficult oftentimes for people in trying to make sure that all of this works in our houses. And so they figured out not only could they, if they could sell the boxes, but how could they like install them and service them to make sure that they're working properly and connected properly. That became their competitive advantage. They redefined who they were, and logistics became a part of not just, hi, come into our store and buy the box and leave. Buy the box, buy the television, buy the phone, whatever it is. But how do you develop that ongoing relationship with the customer? The second example is Target, who I talked about earlier. They figured out that if you could shop online, right? Their phrase is, there is no such thing as e-commerce. There's just commerce, right? It's some of it's digital and some of it's physical. If you're in the store, you're using your phone to understand what you want to buy, where to buy from, where it's located in the store. The next one is Home Depot. Home Depot, the home improvement company here in the United States. Craig Miniar talks about don't fight the inevitable. Some of the established physical retail companies say, well, we've got these stores, we've got this real estate we're paying for, we've got to find a way to make it work. And Craig was like, our customers want to shop online. How do we give them a better experience by allowing them to shop online and then get what they need in the stores? In the case of Home Depot, a kitchen sink or lumber doesn't ship well through Amazon Prime. Okay, but what you do want to do is you can shop online, and then they built 18 regional distribution centers across the United States that can deliver anything that Home Depot has to a store near a consumer within 3 hours. So they figured out how to blend digital and physical, and logistics is the key to that. Logistics becomes the thing that enables that to happen. And by the way, when customers now need to have a kind of a visibility or a window into the logistics to know whether or not they can get a product, that will deliver a better customer experience, that when they buy it, they know they can physically get it in 3 hours. It doesn't necessarily have to be delivered to their house. That's part of logistics. But if you can use that in combination between the digital and the physical in a store, that's when you serve customers better.
And I kind of I've put all those brown competencies which I've put there, logistics, manufacturing, economies of scale, managing ecosystems, and longevity. I'm going to let the not sort of spill out all the secrets, because the readers must read this book. I totally recommend this because I just learned so much in going through this book, which is fabulous. I want to actually take the conversation to another aspect of it, which is, what do we do as individuals, to lead organizations in this new world where so many, competencies are required by the organization. What should that look like? What can organizations do? What can individuals do? I sort of really want to take the conversation in that direction. In the
And
book,
I'll
I know
start.
you talked about systems leadership,
Yeah.
Rob. Talk to me a little bit about, systems leadership. What does that look like?
So this was the course I co-teach with Jeff Immelt, my former boss at GE and the former CEO. And one of the things that we really kind of started studying was this notion that when everything's connected, you really have to understand that flow of what's happening back and forth with data, with interpersonal interactions. And so we saw that in the old days, you used to be able to rise up in an organization. You could be in manufacturing, you could be in engineering, you could be in marketing and sales. And if you had teammates that handled the other functions, everything was fine as long as you had good teammates. But now leaders need to be able to understand not only their own area of expertise, but they need to understand some of the other competencies inside the organization and what happens to it. And the attributes that we saw is great leaders need to be able to operate at intersections. We talked about aligned technology, the ability to understand a business model innovation with a technological innovation. You have to have the ability to basically be able to manage operational excellence, but also know how to manage innovation. Be able to, you as a leader, in the old days, you had the operating team and the innovation team. Leaders now need to be able to understand how to do both. You need to be conversant in both. You need to understand both global and local. Michelin, which is one of these, the great French tire and material science company, they have this notion and this idea that they've got a platform that operates globally, in their material science competencies, but they can customize tires for specific markets. Great systems leaders need to be much better communicators than they were in the past. They need to know how to manage context. Truth equals facts plus context. So truth for your employees, for your customers, equals facts plus context. And so great systems leaders need to manage the context. What do all the facts mean? What's right or good about what's being understood. And so great systems leaders need to be able to communicate internally and externally well. They need to have a product manager's mindset. They need to really understand, like, what do customers need? How does a product get built and how does it get delivered? They need to understand truth. And by that, I mean their own biases. We are shaped by truth. Not only do we have to have context to manage how it's communicated, but like, what are our own blind spots? And blind spots, are not necessarily a bad thing. We all have them. And do you have trusted individuals who can tell you the truth or how you or your organization is being perceived? And by the way, sometimes those truth tellers don't lie inside of the organization. You need people outside of the organization, because the more senior you get in your own company, basically you're never wrong in your own conference room. Like, your employees will not tell you you're wrong. And so you need people outside who will say, like, no, you're wrong. Obviously, you got this completely wrong. And so, like, kind of the role that our spouses often play in our lives when they look at us and say, no, you're wrong on this one. You need people outside of your companies to be able to help you with that. And then lastly, you've got to be asking yourself questions like, have you stayed current? Katrina Lake, she's the chairman and founder of Stitch Fix here in the United States. She asks all of her direct reports one question every year, which is, if you were hiring for your position today, would you hire yourself? Like, oh my God, you walk into a room full of executives and ask that question, watch all the color leave their face. Because have you stayed current? Have you stayed current with what's going on? And if not, what are you going to do to keep yourself current? You've got to keep educating yourselves and learning. You've got to be conversant in things like artificial intelligence and automation and analytics and additive manufacturing. Like, you have to have an opinion on how these things are going to impact your businesses. And then finally, how do you lead through times of uncertainty? You need to know your own strengths and development needs. In my case, my strength and my development need, they are the biggest ones I have on each. It's exactly the same thing. My passion is my greatest strength. Like, if I'm in the classroom, I'm running up and down the aisles, I'm getting in the students' faces, I'm waving my arms around, I'm talking too quickly. I mean, I'm having the time of my life. My passion can also be my greatest development need. Like, when I was younger, I would get these emails and they would make me angry, and I'd hit reply all, and I would send the most amazing flame emails that you could possibly imagine. I'd hit reply all and even add a few more people, and my replies would be cutting, and they would be sarcastic, and they would be accurate, and they were always ineffective. They were always ineffective. And I've had to learn to control my passion so that I can be effective in what I'm doing. So I think systems leaders have to have all these things that we've talked about: the ability to operate in intersections, a product manager's mindset, know how to manage context, be aware of their own bias, and then finally, know what's going on inside in times of great uncertainty.
I like that phrase. I mean, what is a product manager's mindset? Talk to me about that. Just for the purpose of our listeners, what is a product manager's role? Why is it so special? And what is that mindset that you're talking about? So, who is a product manager really?
A product manager is usually the man or woman who's responsible for owning kind of the formation of the idea of the product, the development of it, commercial launch, and even the end of life of a particular product. And so the product manager's mindset, what's really interesting about a product manager is they're responsible for everything and they own nothing. Okay, so they've got to figure out how to get other parts of the organization to do what they want them to do when they can't give direct orders. My colleague Amir Goldberg here at Stanford talks about how product managers need to become what he calls the ultimate polymorph. They need to be able to fit in to all of the other organizations such that all those other organizations think that, oh, this person's one of us. So a product manager has to be able to do kind of the organizational jujitsu, be able to kind of get the organization to move through influence, through cajoling, without being able to crack the whip and directly control the resources. They need to have an intimate understanding of the customers and what's happening outside of the building. They really need to know and have that deep level of understanding customer outcomes. They need to know how a product gets built or a service gets delivered inside of their company. So they have the respect of the operations and the engineering and manufacturing teams. And then finally, they have to be able to give the tools to the sales team to, if you will, separate customers from their money. And so great product managers need to do all these things. That's part of seeing the system. And I'm going to argue, and I do argue, that systems leaders, whether they're a C-level executive or all the way down to middle managers, need to have those competencies. And that product manager mindset is the ability to know not just what's going on in your function, but the ability to see the whole picture and kind of be at that hub and spoke of how work gets done inside of an organization.
What are a couple of things that people can do starting tomorrow if they had to develop this mindset, regardless of whether they are in a product manager role or not? I mean, I think that the mindset is pretty useful. How do I build that in me? What would you recommend?
Well, the great thing about the resources we have on the internet, you can take classes to learn about some of the technologies that I mentioned. Do you understand artificial intelligence? Do you understand additive manufacturing? So a lot of it's just kind of taking the time and the energy to invest in ourselves and make sure that we keep our competencies current. Education is an ongoing lifelong experience for us, and that's acutely true, especially as technology changes so rapidly. I think the other things that we can do is trying to be open and honest with ourselves of, when are the times in our past that we've been successful, that we were good at our jobs, and when were the times in our past that we just got lucky? And so can you understand the difference between skill and luck? So you can understand, okay, this was skill. This is maybe one of my superpowers. I need to do more of this. And I succeeded here, but that's because a rising tide raises all boats, right? So how did I just get lucky? It really wasn't about me. And I think there's a self-awareness that comes with it. And I think, I talked earlier about bias, knowing what our own bias is. A great example of this in my venture capital business, my partner was trained as a lawyer. I was trained as an operator and as a CEO. So we look at investment opportunities very differently. He looks at it through the filter of well, what are the legal aspects, et cetera, et cetera. And I look at it of, can I make and sell the product? Now, those are biases right there. He's got a legal bias and I've got an operating bias. Do you have people who can complement where you might have blind spots or skill sets that aren't yours, but you understand what they are? So I think it's that kind of self-awareness is really, really important on an ongoing basis.
But that's so hard to manage because, working with people who bring in a very different mindset, this is one of the things that I certainly have struggled with a lot. That, how do you work with somebody whose style is polar opposite of yours? If you're a big picture guy and, like looking at somebody who is a very detail oriented person can be exasperating. You kind of say, oh my God, I mean, this person really forever, looking at the nuts and bolts and putting the commas and full stops there. But
Mhm.
that's really what you need. And, it takes a lot of effort to, appreciate that. But we have a question here from, Aditya, who's asking this question that does a project manager, I beg your pardon,
Mhm.
does a project manager require to have a deep technical understanding of a product in order to be successful, or does the project manager require to have more of people management skills? What do you think?
So it's a great question. I have a very strong opinion of this, and there are a lot of people who disagree with me. So let me see if I can give you both sides. Brian Rakowski, who was the first product manager at Google, Brian believes that the only product managers, especially in a technology company, have to have an engineering undergraduate degree. He fundamentally thinks if you don't have an engineering undergraduate degree, you are not capable of being a product manager. And I think that's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard in my whole life. Now, let me be clear. Brian is 10 times smarter than I am and 20 times more successful than I'll ever be. But I think that we as have the ability to learn technologies if we are genuinely interested in it. So I think a great product manager has to be curious about how things work. And so you talked about the people skills. That has to be what a product and a project manager has to do. Do you have to, have had a training in electrical engineering or computer science or mechanical engineering? I'm living proof that you don't. My career in great and deep technology companies, places like Intel, where I had to earn the trust of Andy Grove, I was able to do that because I really wanted to know how things work. I studied political science as an undergrad. That allowed me to learn how to write. And my story behind that is I wasn't a very good engineer. Like I was average. It was horrible. In fact, it would have been great if I was a terrible engineer. It wasn't that I was a terrible engineer. I was average. That, like, to me, was like the worst possible thing that I would ever want to do. But I still loved learning how things worked. And so when I think a great product or project manager has to love his or her product and has to like want to understand what makes it go. That's about what we do inside. Like we all have brains. We can all learn new things. We just need to apply ourselves. So my long-winded answer to your question is I think great product and product managers have both. Brian would say, no, you have to be an engineer. And I just think that's Silicon Valley bias. So I disagree with him.
I think, I would sort of agree with your assessment because, I believe that eventually when you're interested in people, you get curious about other stuff. One of my hypotheses or, assumptions is that people who are curious are fundamentally interested in people because you don't become interested in, an abstract concept. There's a person who's ideas really shape you or your thinking, and that's where your curiosity begins. And you probably learn much faster if you learn with a variety of people who are having you are having these conversations with. So I think that's what I do. And like for example, this LinkedIn Live for me is a really great way of having conversations with people who are much smarter than me, and that's this, which is how I thought Robert Siegel would be the right person to have on this show. But yeah, I also think that I want to know about how do you stay current? What is your upgradation process like? Imagine you're an app. What do you do to get refreshed?
So I think I do two things that are kind of unique to my situation. The first is I'm really lucky. Every year I get 500 new children my graduate students at Stanford, and I call them my children, even though they're adults, but they're half my age. And being around the younger generation allows me to see how do they look at the world and how is it different than how I look at the world. Our Debbie's and my children are now 23, 21, and 19, so they're adults. But when they were young, looking how they interacted with technology was a great thing. Now, through my ability to hang out with my students at Stanford, I really get to see how they look at the world. And my students come from all over the world. Teaching at Stanford's like teaching at the United Nations. And so you really get a global perspective. I think the second thing is, I try to push myself into my zone of discomfort before the world pushes me there. Twice in my career that I can think of specifically, I got stale. The world started to pass me by and I had to reinvent myself. And those are very scary times in one's careers when you realize you haven't stayed fresh, you're not up to speed on what's coming up. So like right now, what I'm in the process of doing is I'm basically shutting down of the 6 courses I teach. I'm shutting down 5 of them, and I'm in the process of trying to develop 5 new courses. So like trying to make that notion of disrupting ourselves and doing it before somebody else disrupts us, it's a lot scary, not a little scary. It's scary. Like right now I've got these classes that are in high demand and I seem to have a good rapport with the students and it's great. And I'm going to, kind of quit when I'm on top on those classes and try to develop new things. So I think it's our ability and our desire and our willingness to push ourselves into new areas. I think that's kind of one of the key things that we can do. It's hard. It is hard. There are times when I'm thinking like, oh my God, wouldn't it just be easier to keep doing what I've been doing because it works? But I know that eventually that will become stale, and I don't ever want to become stale.
So, where do you gather your ideas from? I mean, what's your process of doing that?
I'm kind of a bumbler. So there's this notion in the book that we call grinding creativity. There's some people who get struck by lightning. I just kind of like, I'm always reading. I'm always talking to people. I try to surround myself with people who I disagree with. As strange as that sounds, like, my new course on business and government, my co-teacher, Anat Admati, she and I could not be more different in how we view the world. But being around her, I've learned an unbelievable amount. I mean, she's amazingly brilliant. And so kind of, try to be around people who are different kind of gives me a different perspective. Like to think that as I'm getting older, I'm comfortable enough in my own opinions that have been formed and shaped over time, but I'm always hopefully willing to learn and try to see how my thinking might need to evolve. So I think it's reading a lot. It's talking to other people and trying to kind of get out of our bubbles, get out of our echo chambers and talk to other people and be open to what other people have to say.
So, when you look at the future, you are part of, okay, let me step back, and I'm going to ask you a politically incorrect question. There's a lot of conversation about B schools becoming irrelevant, because business models are changing so much, and all that is happening. Do you think an MBA degree is useless going forward? I mean, is it something worth doing, or it's not worth doing? What would you say?
It's a totally legitimate question. And I think what we have is there are a couple of forces that people are blending together that we need to break apart. I think we had an oversupply of MBA programs. And so it's a very, very expensive degree, which is actually, I think, one of the big risks. And so I think spending a lot of money to getting a second or third tier MBA degree, no, you can actually get a lot of that information online. So the cost benefit ratio may not be there. But if you're lucky enough to go to a top engineering school, no matter where in the world it is, right? Whether it's in India or in the United States or Europe or other parts of the world, you not only will get to learn from great faculty members, but you're going to get access to a network of people. And so that, you'll get skills that you'll learn in the classroom, you'll get access to a network. And so I think the MBA actually is a degree. Now, by the way, the MBA degree is very different today than it was 30 years ago when I got mine. It's far more experiential, right? There's a lot of more hands-on learning. It's not just case methods. You have the ability to get leaders from all over the world who will come in and talk about how to apply the blending of the academic with the practitioner. I mean, I'm a practitioner, but I co-teach with academics, and you see the blending of trying to how you use your brain to think, but also how you apply it in the working world. And so I think there's a lot of amazing things that you can get out of a great degree. I think you're going to see some schools that will eventually kind of go away, and we're seeing it right now. On the other hand, as long as the top schools continue to reinvent themselves and continue to meet the people who hire our students, we give our students the skill sets they need to be successful. Yeah, we'll be able to stay relevant, but that's on us, right? It's up to us to prove ourselves that we're worth it.
And so, my big takeaway is if don't do an MBA degree from a second tier or third tier school, do it from a top place. And that's the unfiltered, advice that we are getting from you. So really, Rob, we are at the last minute. So I just want to take a couple of minutes and say thank you very much. Thank you to all our listeners who've joined in for all the questions that you asked, because, I count on your questions to really bring a lot more variety than just one person's point of view. So thank you very much. I'm deeply grateful. Look forward to another wonderful guest of mine who's coming up next week, who's written another book that I really enjoyed. So don't miss on that one. Thank you so much, Rob. Just stay in the studio while we play this goodbye tune for our viewers.